Morning light crept across the kitchen of a modest brick house in Cedar Falls, Ohio. The kind of town where people still wave at passing mail trucks and everyone knows the smell of fresh coffee before sunrise. Inside that kitchen sat Adelina Murphy Case, 66 years old, neat gray hair pinned back, her robe tied at the waist. Across from her, Emilio Case, 68, stirred his mug with the slow precision of habit. The sound of the spoon was the only movement in the room. For 40 years they had built a rhythm around silence. Comfortable at first, then efficient, then heavy. Adelina watched the steam rise between them like a curtain neither could lift. He finally cleared his throat. "If I'm honest," he said, eyes still fixed on the mug, "I regret marrying you." It was spoken softly, almost thoughtfully, as though he were reading a line from the newspaper. No anger, no build-up. Just the dull edge of truth delivered too late to matter. Her first instinct was disbelief. Surely he didn't mean it, but his face never shifted. The sunlight caught the silver in his hair, the wedding band still on his finger, and somehow that made it worse. Adelina's hands lay folded in her lap. She didn't tremble. She didn't blink fast. She simply stared at the pattern on the tablecloth she'd bought back in 1989 from a Sears clearance rack. 40 years of meals, bills, and birthdays had passed across that fabric, and now, with one sentence, it became a witness to something final. She waited for him to soften, to add a clumsy "I didn't mean it," but he just took a sip. The humiliation arrived slow, like a heat spreading under the skin. It wasn't the first time he'd wounded her with words, but it was the first time she realized he no longer cared if he did. She stood up quietly, chair legs scraping against the tile. Her knees ached, her back protested, but she kept her posture straight. "Coffee's getting cold," he murmured without looking up. That was all. Upstairs, their bedroom looked like every morning before, bed neatly made, his cufflinks in the tray, her robe draped over the door. Yet nothing felt familiar anymore. She moved through the room like an archaeologist unearthing someone else's life. She pulled the old Samsonite suitcase from under the bed, dust rising from its metal clasps. Fold, breathe, fold again, each shirt and sweater, a relic of years spent keeping a house that had long stopped feeling like home. On the dresser sat her diary, bound in brown leather. Inside were 40 years of her handwriting, grocery lists beside apologies, notes about the kids beside confessions she'd never spoken aloud. She touched it once, then twice, considering whether to take it. Instead she left it inside the nightstand drawer. Let him find it, she thought. Let him read the things I never said. Downstairs, Emilio had moved on to the crossword puzzle. "Where are you off to?" he asked. Eyes still on the paper. "Out," she said simply. He nodded, indifferent. She slipped on her shoes, picked up her car keys, and paused at the doorway. No one stopped her. Not the husband who once promised her forever. Not the framed wedding photo hanging above the coat rack, him young and confident, her bright-eyed and full of faith and promises. She left the photo hanging crooked. The air outside was crisp and unapologetic. The world looked the same. Neighbors walking dogs, a garbage truck groaning up the street, a school bus flashing its lights. But inside her something vast had cracked open. She slid behind the wheel of her aging Buick LaCrosse, the seat cold against her palms. As she backed out of the driveway, the house shrank in the rearview mirror, brown shutters, white trim, quiet as a mausoleum. She remembered the early days, 1983, their wedding in a church that smelled of lilies and floor polish. The way he used to tuck a note inside her lunch bag, when she worked as a receptionist at Hampton & Sons Hardware. Back then, silence had felt like peace. Now it felt like burial. At the first red light, Adelina's eyes burned, but no tears came. She turned the radio off and listened to her own breath, steady and new. Her humiliation had been private, invisible, but it would not stay that way forever. She didn't know it yet, but this morning would become the first page of his regret. The road stretched wide and empty outside Cedar Falls, pale winter sun slanting across the windshield as Adelina Case drove without direction. She passed familiar signs, Maple Avenue, Haven's Florist, the old Blue Jay Diner, where she and Emilio once spent Friday nights sharing pie. Now even the memory of that sweetness felt foreign. When the numbness thinned enough for thought, she parked in the lot behind St. Germain's Church. The place had been part of their life since their wedding, the one where she wore her sister's veil, and he'd carved their initials on the pew's underside. She sat there for a while, watching sunlight filter through the stained glass. The colors fell over her hands, like small mercies she didn't feel she deserved. In that stillness, she began to replay the years, one humiliation after another, stitched together so tightly, they almost looked like a normal marriage. She remembered their 25th wedding anniversary, when she'd spent days preparing, white tablecloths, candles, the good china she'd bought on layaway from Burlington Home and Company. Their grown children, Evan and Rachel, flew in and friends filled the house. The night smelled of lemon polish and baked salmon. When the moment came for the toast, everyone lifted their glasses. Her best friend Kimora Tucker said, "To Adelina and Emilio, still strong after 25 years." The room clapped. Emilio stood, tugging at his tie, and gave a half smile. "Well," he said, 25 years is a long time to tolerate anyone." Laughter rippled around the table. Adelina laughed too, the kind of laugh that hides behind good manners. But something inside her sank. When the guests left, she washed dishes alone while he watched a late baseball rerun. She had wanted to ask him, "Did you mean that?" But she already knew the answer. That night she wrote in her diary, "Maybe love becomes invisible when you stop demanding to be seen." Mead Ray, she thought about all the smaller moments that followed, the neighborhood barbecue where someone asked what she did with her time now that the kids were gone, and Emilio had cut in, saying, "Oh, Adelina, she's a professional worrier. The woman can't sit still." Everyone laughed again. So did she. Because that's what you do when your dignity becomes a punchline. He never yelled, he never hit. His cruelty was quiet, the kind that slips in through ordinary moments and builds walls taller than rage ever could. Back home, she stepped through her own front door like a stranger. She could smell his cologne, Pine Ridge No. 5, drifting faintly through the hallway. The house looked neat, contained, harmless. Yet it felt like a museum curated to display her own disappearance. She moved from room to room, touching things. The quilt she'd sewn in 1995, after a miscarriage no one but her remembered. The coffee pot she'd bought to surprise him on their 10th Christmas. He'd never thanked her, but he'd used it every day since. The piano gathering dust in the corner. She hadn't played in years, because he said the sound distracted him when he balanced the checkbook. Every object was a fossil of something she'd once loved. She opened drawers, closets and cupboards, uncovering herself layer by layer, photo albums, greeting cards, an apron embroidered Mrs. Case. The apron stopped her. She ran her thumb over the faded stitching. For years she'd believed that title, Mrs. Case, was something to protect. Now it felt like evidence in a trial she hadn't realized she was losing. Upstairs again, she sat on the bed and opened her diary. The one she had left behind earlier that morning but retrieved after remembering what it contained. Her handwriting filled every page, like small footsteps across decades of silence. She read bits aloud to the empty room. "He forgot my birthday. Said the cake was too sweet. He made a joke about my cooking again tonight. I apologized for crying. He said I make everything dramatic." The ink had faded in places, but the pain still felt fresh. Adelina shut the diary and whispered to the air, "You wanted honesty, Emilio. Here it is." She set the book on the nightstand, not to keep, but to leave as witness. Then she took a slow look around the room, his cufflinks in their tray, his tie draped over the chair. Her gaze lingered on the framed wedding photo atop the dresser. She in lace, he in navy. She imagined whispering to that young woman, "Don't shrink yourself to fit his silence." For a fleeting second, she thought about staying, confronting him, shouting, demanding answers. But that would make him the audience again. No, she decided. If there was to be a reckoning, it would happen without his applause. Method. By evening the suitcase was zipped shut. She tucked a note inside the drawer under her diary. 3 words. "Read before you forget." She wasn't sure he would. But that too would be its own revenge. When she stepped outside again, the street was quiet. The neighbor's porch lights flickered on, and somewhere a dog barked. Adelina took one last look at the house she had built from patience, and whispered a line she'd once read in a forgotten book. "Some prisons have wallpaper instead of bars." She locked the door behind her, leaving her life inside like a story she no longer wanted to finish. The guest room in Kimora Tucker's house smelled faintly of lavender detergent and sunlight on cotton. The walls were a soft cream, the window framed by lace curtains that fluttered when the breeze slipped in. It wasn't much, a twin bed, a lamp, a small dresser, but to Adelina Case, It felt like the first square of peace she'd stood on in years. Kimora had been her closest friend since their days at Hampton and Sons Hardware, back when Adelina's hands were steadier and her laughter came easier. She didn't ask questions when Adelina showed up with a suitcase and swollen eyes. She simply opened the door, hugged her tight, and said, "You can stay as long as you need." That first night, Adelina lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the faint tick of Kimora's kitchen clock echoing down the hall. It was the kind of silence that didn't punish her, it allowed her to breathe, but that didn't mean she knew what to do with it. By morning she'd made the bed, wiped the windowsills, folded towels that didn't need folding. She cooked breakfast for two, even though Kimora was still asleep. Old habits die quietly. When Kimora wandered in, robe tied, eyes half closed, she chuckled softly. "You don't have to earn your keep here, honey." Adelina smiled faintly. "I know, I just don't know how to sit still." Kimora's eyes warmed. "Then sit with me. We'll learn together." Nya's days bled into weeks. Adelina found herself listening to the hum of the dishwasher, the rustle of trees outside, the sound of her own thoughts. She hadn't realized how many years she'd filled silence with service. Cooking, cleaning, fixing, smoothing. Without that, she felt unanchored. At night she'd catch herself halfway to the phone, tempted to check if Emilio had called. He hadn't. He never would, not unless he needed something. Still, she'd scroll through old photos on her Samsung Galaxy, pausing on family gatherings, the smiles, the posed laughter, the illusion that everything was fine. Now she could see what she couldn't before. She wasn't part of those pictures. She was the one behind them, holding the camera. Always watching, never seen. One late evening, she found herself in Kimora's kitchen, unable to sleep. She poured tea, then spotted an old blue leather notebook, tucked behind the flour jar. Inside were recipes in Kimora's handwriting, and one loose page that wasn't a recipe at all. It read, "The only way to stop disappearing is to notice yourself first." Adelina pressed the paper to her chest, as if afraid it might vanish. That night, she pulled a clean notebook from her suitcase, the one she'd bought years ago but never used, and wrote in neat cursive, "I don't know who I am without being needed, but I'm still here." For the first time, the words didn't sound like mourning. They sounded like a beginning. Minutes later, Kimora convinced her to step out. "You need fresh air, sugar, and people who aren't ghosts from your old house." They drove downtown to Fletcher Square, where a local community center was hosting an art fair. Among pottery, quilts, and crafts, a sign caught Adelina's eye, "Watercolor for beginners. Saturdays 10 a.m. Kimora nudged her. "You always loved color." "I haven't painted since college," Adelina said, "then it's overdue." The following Saturday, she stood in a small classroom that smelled of paint and paper. The instructor, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, handed her a brush. Her hands trembled slightly, as she dipped it in pale blue. The color bled softly across the page, imperfect and alive. Something inside her cracked, not from sadness, but from remembering she could still create. She didn't paint well, not at first. Her clouds looked like stains, her trees crooked. But when she saw how light could soften even a mistake, she felt something unfamiliar, relief. After class, she walked to the nearby bakery, bought herself a croissant, and ate it alone by the window. She realized she wasn't lonely. She was free. Mealy Cled each day began to take shape again. Morning walks around Lakeview Park. Afternoons helping Kimora in her garden, kneeling in the dirt, feeling the earth under her nails. Evenings spent writing small truths in her new journal. "Today someone smiled at me at the store. The sky turned pink and stayed that way for 10 minutes. I didn't cry at all." Her healing wasn't cinematic in the loud way. No grand gestures, no triumphant music. It was in the small things: brewing tea without rushing, humming softly while folding laundry, buying herself a bouquet for no reason. And slowly word drifted through the small-town grapevine. Emilio Case was struggling. He'd started showing up at church alone, sitting in the back pew. His once pressed shirts now hung wrinkled. The house was overgrown, the gutters sagged. Neighbors whispered that he seemed lost, that his grown children barely visited anymore. Kimora heard it first, and told Adelina gently one evening, over dinner. Adelina didn't react much, just nodded, pushing her mashed potatoes around the plate. Inside though, something steadied. Not joy, not gloating, just a deep knowing. He had created the silence. Now he was drowning in it. Nistity. That night, she sat by the open window, journal on her lap, and wrote one line in deliberate script. I thought I was the one who vanished, but maybe he did first. She closed the book and exhaled. The house was quiet, but this silence was hers now, and it was finally starting to sound like peace. Winter came to Cedar Falls, wrapped in gray skies and brittle air. The trees outside Kimura Tucker's house stood bare, like old witnesses who'd already heard too much. Adelina Case, now 67, moved slower in the mornings, but her heart no longer carried the heaviness of before. She had painted all through the autumn, lavender hills, quiet lakes, the outline of a woman standing at a window. She sold 2 pieces at a local crafts fair, more as tokens of healing than art. When she spoke to herself now, her voice was softer but certain, the way someone sounds when they've stopped asking for permission to exist. Then one afternoon, in late January, her phone rang. The screen flashed a familiar name, Evan Case, her son. It had been weeks since they last spoke. Mom. His voice trembled a little. Dad found your diary. Adelina's stomach nodded, but her tone stayed calm. I see. He read it. Evan said quietly. Every page. There was a pause. He showed me parts of it. Adelina closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Did he? He looked destroyed. Evan continued. He just sat there shaking, said he didn't recognize the man in those pages. Adelina didn't answer at first. She could almost picture it, Emilio sitting in that same kitchen where he once confessed his regret, now staring at words written in the handwriting he'd ignored for years. Her careful private words, every entry she'd once written to survive, now standing as evidence against his pride. Inside that diary, she had written everything she couldn't say aloud. He mocks what he can't control. I told him my feelings. He told me I exaggerate. He said I talk too much about love, as if silence is nobler. I make his coffee. He pours mine down the drain. For 40 years she'd been the quiet chronicler of her own disappearance. Now her words had become the mirror he couldn't escape. Mom. Evan said softly. He asked me if you ever loved him. Adelina almost smiled. A slow, tired smile that didn't reach her eyes. You can tell him I did, and I stopped when he did. The line went quiet, then Evan whispered. He's sorry, Mom, she sighed. He's sorry because he's lonely, not because he's changed. But that's enough punishment, don't you think? That evening she sat by Kimura's fire, with a blanket around her knees. She could almost feel it, the irony, the poetic justice. She hadn't screamed, hadn't plotted, hadn't tried to ruin him. Her revenge had unfolded like a letter read too late. Mias. 2 days later another call came. This time from Emilio himself. Adelina, he began. His voice was thinner, older. I shouldn't have read that diary. But you did, she said calmly. I needed to understand. What did you find? She asked. Silence stretched through the line, long and hollow. I found a woman I forgot existed, he said at last. And a man I wish I didn't recognize. She listened. Not out of softness, but out of closure. He continued, voice cracking. I can't fix what I broke. But I thought you should know I'm sorry. She said sorry is easy, she said quietly. She regret takes work. He didn't argue. He only said, I sent something in the mail. Please read it. Then the line clicked dead. Me envelope arrived 2 days later, postmarked Cedar Falls. Inside was a handwritten letter, thick with ink and hesitation. Adelina, I read every line. I thought silence meant peace. I thought providing was love. I see now it was your silence that held everything together. I failed to thank you for the home, the children, the years, and the softness you gave me when I didn't deserve it. I regret the man I became. I've signed over my share of the house, and the savings. It's not atonement, just acknowledgement. Hugh deserved more than my comfort. Emilio. Adelina read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer, not to treasure it, just to mark that justice had finally come full circle. That night, Kimura found her sitting on the porch, the letter beside her teacup. Well? Kimura asked gently. He finally regrets it. Adelina said. But that's between him and his conscience, not me. Kimura studied her friend's face, lined but luminous in the porch light. So what now? Adelina looked toward the dark horizon. Now I let him live with the silence he built. Me and Wolfsbach in Cedar Falls. Emilio sat alone in that same kitchen, the same table, same mug, same empty chair across from him. The house was quiet, except for the clock ticking too loudly. He'd thought he could handle solitude. But now he understood. Solitude and abandonment are not the same. He poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, one for himself, one for the woman he'd dismissed. Only 1 cup steamed, the other stayed cold, and for the first time in his life, he whispered into the silence, "Adelina, I see you." But she was miles away, and she didn't need to be seen anymore. Spring returned to Ohio, slow and reluctant, as if the world itself was learning how to thaw. By then, Adelina Case had packed what little she needed, a few clothes, her paints, and the framed photo of her children as toddlers, and left Kimura Tucker's home with a long hug and no tears. Her destination was the old Marsh Lake cabin, a quiet cedar lodge she'd inherited from an aunt years ago but never used. The roof sagged, the windows needed washing, but when she stepped onto that porch for the first time in decades, she felt something inside her exhale. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked soil. Birdsong carried across the water, and the silence, oh the silence, felt new. Not punishing this time, not weaponized. It was freedom wearing calm's disguise. She spent her first few days cleaning. The cabin's floorboards creaked under her weight, dust dancing in sunlight as she swept. She washed curtains, scrubbed the old sink, and stacked firewood by the door. It wasn't work, it was reclamation. Each motion whispered, "You belong here now." The days found a rhythm. Mornings she'd walk by the lake, collecting stones worn smooth by years of current. Afternoons she painted soft watercolors of the view outside her window, pale skies, rippling water, the curve of the trees. And evenings she wrote in her journal, not of pain anymore, but of presence. "I made soup today. I laughed when I spilled it. I am learning to exist without apology." One afternoon, she mailed a simple notice to her children, her new address written in neat cursive. No explanations, no bitterness. A week later, a package arrived at her doorstep. New brushes. A note from her daughter Rachel Case Galvin that read, "For the next chapter, Mom, I'm proud of you." Adelina smiled. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. The kind that starts small and true. By early summer, the cabin had transformed into a sanctuary. With Kimura's help, she built a tiny side studio, 4 walls of pine and a skylight that bathed everything in gold. She pinned her paintings on a line, and began hosting weekend watercolor classes for women in town. Most were in their 60s, widows or divorcees carrying quiet heartbreaks of their own. They'd sit together at long tables, dipping brushes into jars of color, sharing stories they'd never told their husbands. Laughter returned to Adelina's life there, not the polite, restrained kind she'd used for decades, but the kind that reached the eyes. Sometimes when the class ended, she'd stand by the lake and watch the reflections ripple, a dozen women discovering color again. It wasn't about art, it was about remembering that beauty could still live in imperfect hands. Then came a letter, familiar handwriting on the envelope, thin and wavering. She almost didn't open it, but curiosity still lived somewhere under her ribs. Inside was a short note from Emilio. "The house is sold. I've moved into a retirement community near town. It's quiet here. Too quiet. I wanted you to know I kept your last painting, the one of the Blue Hills. I look at it every morning. It reminds me that silence can be loud. Take care of yourself. E." Adelina folded the letter once, then again, and placed it in the drawer of her studio desk. She didn't feel pity or longing, just completion. Nias. That evening Rachel drove up to visit, bringing her youngest daughter and a basket of groceries. The two of them cooked dinner together, pasta with herbs from Adelina's garden, and sat by the porch as the sky turned amber. "Mom," Rachel said softly, "you're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." Adelina smiled faintly. "I just stopped pretending I wasn't." They watched the lake shimmer under the setting sun. Crickets began to sing in the reeds. Rachel rested her head on her mother's shoulder like she hadn't done since childhood. For a long time they stayed like that. 2 generations of women finally sharing silence that didn't hurt. Later, after Rachel and the little one had gone to bed, Adelina took her journal out to the porch. The moon hung low over Marsh Lake, its reflection trembling on the surface. She dipped her pen and wrote, "I didn't leave to be alone. I left so he could finally understand what alone feels like. And I am finally whole. She closed the book gently. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of lavender. Somewhere in the darkness, a loon called across the water, a single haunting sound that made her smile. Inside, the clock ticked softly, counting not time, but peace. For the first time in 40 years, Adelina Case didn't wait for footsteps, didn't listen for voices, didn't measure her worth by someone else's acknowledgement. She simply existed, her own witness, her own redemption. And far away, in a quiet retirement apartment across town, Emilio Case sat awake, staring at the same moon through a small window, his cup of coffee cooling untouched beside him. He whispered into the dark, "I regret marrying you." Then softer, "Because I ruined the best thing I ever had." The lake rippled, the night deepened, and somewhere between them, regret finally found its home.